had. If they see you, it's over. The words didn't sound like a suggestion, they sounded like a countdown, and Ethan Caldwell felt them land before his mind could catch up, his hand still resting on the polished brass doorknob of his $12 million Manhattan townhouse. The scent of lemon oil and marble dust lingering in the air like everything was exactly as it should be, except it wasn't, because Naomi Brooks never looked like that. Never stood in the hallway with her shoulders tight and her voice barely above a whisper, never. Reached for him like she was pulling him away from something invisible but dangerously real, and yet here she was, eyes wide, breath uneven, fingers gripping his sleeve just enough to stop him from taking another step forward. Sir, please, she said again, softer now, almost breaking, you can't let them know you're back. Ethan blinked once, twice, a man used to control, to certainty, to knowing exactly what every room contained before he entered it, and yet something in her voice made him pause, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something had shifted beyond his control, and then he heard it, faint at first, drifting down from the second floor like a memory that didn't belong to him, his own voice, calm, confident, unmistakable, laughing at something someone else had said, and the sound hit him harder than any argument ever could, because it wasn't just similar, it was exact, precise down to the rhythm, the pause, the tone. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked at Naomi. That's not possible, he said under his breath. But she was already shaking her head, already pulling him toward the study, her movements quick but careful, like every second mattered, like every second might already be too late. You have to trust me, she whispered, pressing her hand against a hidden panel he hadn't used in years, the wall sliding open just enough to reveal a narrow space behind it, shadows swallowing the light, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't argue, didn't question, he stepped inside. The panel closing behind him with a soft click that sounded far too final, leaving him with a thin sliver of view into the hallway beyond. And that's when he saw him, walking down the staircase like he owned the place, like he had always owned the place, a man wearing Ethan's face, Ethan's suit, Ethan's confidence, every detail so precise it made reality feel like the imitation. And beside him, Victoria Hale descended gracefully, her hand resting lightly on the railing, her expression calm, composed, untouched by anything resembling doubt. "Age is signed tomorrow," she said, her voice smooth, almost bored, as she handed over a folder. The doctor already confirmed everything. It's subtle, just enough confusion to raise questions, nothing obvious. Ethan felt something inside him shift, not panic, not anger, but something colder, sharper, something that recognized betrayal the moment it revealed itself. Naomi appeared beside the panel again. Just enough for him to see her hand as she passed him a small flash drive, her voice barely audible. "I've been watching them," she said, waiting for the right moment, and Ethan's eyes moved from the drive to the reflection in the glass across the hall, where two versions of him now existed, one hidden in the dark, silent, unseen, and one standing in the light, smiling, speaking, living a life that wasn't his anymore. And as Victoria's voice echoed again, softer this time, almost thoughtful, "After tomorrow, Ethan Caldwell won't be a problem." The silence that followed didn't feel empty, it felt like something was about to break, and in that stillness, Naomi whispered one more thing, something that didn't just change the moment, it changed everything that came before it. They didn't used plan this, they've been preparing for years. The silence inside the hidden passage pressed tighter with every second, not empty but loaded, as if the walls themselves were listening, and Ethan Caldwell found his breath slowing against his will, his eyes fixed on the narrow opening where his own life was unfolding without him, the man wearing his face moving with practiced ease, not hesitating, not guessing, but knowing exactly where everything was, exactly how to stand, how to speak, how to exist as if he had always been Ethan Caldwell. And that realization settled deeper than anything Victoria had said, because plans could be made in weeks, deals could be arranged in months, but this level of precision, this kind of imitation, it demanded time, paciencia, observation, years of watching, learning, waiting. And suddenly Naomi's whisper did not sound like a warning anymore, it sounded like a truth that had been buried for far too long. Ethan tightened his grip around the flash drive, his thumb brushing its edge as if it might anchor him to something real. "Years, eh?" Mouthed silently, and Naomi gave the smallest nod from the other side of the panel, her eyes not leaving the hallway, always watching, always calculating, like she had been doing this far longer than he realized. Downstairs the conversation continued, Victoria's voice smooth, controlled, the kind of tone that reassured investors and disarmed critics. "Tomorrow morning, the board will see what they expect to see, a tired man, slightly confused. Nothing dramatic, just enough to justify a temporary transfer of authority. The double nodded, adjusting his cufflinks with a gesture so familiar it made Ethan's chest tighten, and after that, he asked, his voice perfectly aligned, every inflection in place. Victoria smiled faintly, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes. After that, the transition becomes permanent. The word lingered, not heavy, not loud, but final. Ethan leaned closer to the opening, his mind racing through contracts, clauses, contingencies, every safeguard he had ever built now feeling like a blueprint someone else had studied more carefully than he had. Naomi's hand appeared again, this time guiding his phone as she connected the flash drive. The screen lighting up with a quiet glow that felt almost intrusive in the darkness. Video files, audio logs, timestamps stretching back further than he expected, weeks, months, then years. Ethan selected one at random. The footage grainy but clear enough to recognize Victoria sitting across from a man in a white coat, her posture relaxed, her tone measured. It needs to be gradual, she was saying, no sudden changes, no suspicion. The doctor nodded, explaining something about dosage, about behavior, about perception, words that sounded clinical but carried a weight Ethan could not ignore. He skipped forward, another clip, this time the double practicing in an empty room, repeating phrases Ethan had said in interviews, adjusting tone, correcting posture, refining the illusion until it became indistinguishable from the original. Ethan felt something shift again, not shock this time, but clarity, cold and precise, the kind that came when a problem revealed its full shape, when denial no longer had a place to hide. Naomi leaned closer to the panel, her voice barely a breath. They started with small things, she whispered, changes in your schedule, your routines, who had access to you, who you trusted. Ethan's jaw tightened as pieces began to connect. Missed calls, delayed meetings, decisions made in his name that he did not fully remember approving, nothing large enough to question, nothing obvious enough to stop, until now. Downstairs Victoria moved toward the front door, her heels soft against the marble. We should not stay too long, she said calmly, he is not expected back until late. The double nodded, reaching for the folder again. Then tomorrow ends it, he replied, and as the door closed behind them, the house fell into a silence that felt different from before, not calm, not safe, but exposed, as if the truth had stepped out and left everything else behind. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. Two versions of himself now separated by a wall and a choice, and finally he turned slightly toward Naomi, his voice low, steady, no longer uncertain. You said there is more, he said, and for the first time since he had arrived, Naomi hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. They did not choose you randomly, she whispered, and neither did I. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything she had said before, because it was not hesitation born from fear, it was calculation. The kind that came from someone who had held the truth for too long and understood exactly what it would cost to release it. Ethan Caldwell watched her through the narrow opening, his reflection faint against the glass, his mind already shifting from disbelief to strategy, because whatever this was, it was no longer a question of whether it was real, it was a question of how deep it went, and whether he had already lost more than he realized. Start talking, he said quietly, his voice steady now, controlled, the tone he used in boardrooms when numbers stopped making sense. Naomi stepped closer, just enough for her face to come into the thin line of light, her expression no longer frantic, no longer reactive, but focused, grounded. You think they built this plan around your money, she said softly, but they did not. Ethan frowned slightly, the idea not fitting into the framework he had already constructed. Then what, he asked, and Naomi has held his, unwavering, your name, she said, your access, your network, everything that comes with being you, that is what they have been preparing to take. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone, his thoughts moving faster now, recalculating, repositioning, every relationship, every signature, every system that relied on identity rather than presence suddenly felt exposed. Naomi continued before he could respond. They started tracking you years ago, before I ever came here, before Victoria even met you. This was not her idea, she was brought into it. That made Ethan pause, not because it softened the betrayal, but because it expanded it, turned it from something personal into something larger. More deliberate. Who? He asked, and Naomi exhaled slowly, as if the name itself carried weight. A firm that does not exist on paper. They specialize in identity acquisition, not stealing money, not hacking accounts, replacing people. The words settled into the air between them, sharp, precise, impossible to ignore. Ethan glanced back at the phone, at the files Naomi had given him, and suddenly they looked different, not like fragments of a single plan, but pieces of something much bigger. Something structured, layered, designed to unfold without interruption. And you, he asked, his eyes returning to her, where do you fit into this? Naomi looked down for a moment, not in shame, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, as if this was the part she had always known would come. I was not supposed to stop it, she said quietly. I was placed here to observe, to report, to make sure nothing went wrong. Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. You were working for them, he said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating a fact. Naomi nodded once, slow and deliberate. At first, she admitted, but then I started seeing things that were not part of the plan, adjustments, risks, things that could not be controlled, and I realized they were not just replacing you, they were rewriting everything connected to you, people, decisions, outcomes. Ethan felt the weight of that settle deeper than anything else, because it meant this was not just about him, it was about everyone who depended on him, everyone who trusted him. So you switched sides, he said. And Naomi's lips pressed together slightly. I chose to stop watching, she corrected. There is a difference. Downstairs, the faint hum of the city filtered through the walls, distant traffic, a siren far away, life continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet inside the house, everything had shifted. Ethan looked back through the opening, the empty hallway now holding the echo of what had just been revealed, and then he looked at Naomi again, his voice lower, more deliberate. If they have been planning this for years, he said, then they already have a backup plan. Naomi did not hesitate this time. They do, she said, and it starts the moment you try to fight back. Ethan let that settle, not as a warning, but as a parameter, something to work within, something to anticipate. His mind already moving ahead, mapping possibilities, identifying leverage, and then he asked the one question that mattered more than any other, what is the one thing they did not plan for? Naomi met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression, not fear, not urgency, but certainty. You coming home early, she said, and the way she said it made it clear that this moment, this single deviation, had changed the entire equation, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the carefully constructed plan, something had just begun to unravel. The air inside the hidden passage no longer felt suffocating, it felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, and Ethan Caldwell stood still for exactly 2 seconds before his entire posture changed, not rushed, not panicked, but recalibrated, his mind no longer chasing the truth but locking onto it, shaping it, turning it into something usable, because for the first time since he stepped through that door, he understood the one advantage he had. They believed he was not here, and that belief was now the most valuable asset he owned. Then we do not correct their mistake, he said quietly, his voice steady, deliberate, and Naomi watched him closely, not surprised by the shift but measuring it, as if confirming something she had already suspected. You are not going to confront them, she said, and Ethan shook his head once, slow, controlled. Not yet, he replied, his eyes moving back to the empty hallway, seeing not what was there but what would happen next, mapping the next hours like moves on a board. If they think tomorrow is the end, then tonight is where they are most confident. Naomi nodded slightly, understanding the implication without needing it explained. Confidence meant exposure, and exposure meant opportunity. Ethan stepped out of the hidden space, the panel sliding closed behind him with a soft click that sounded different now, less like hiding and more like preparation. The house around him felt unchanged on the surface, the same polished floors, the same quiet elegance, but beneath it, everything had shifted, every room now part of something larger, something that had been operating without his knowledge. Show me everything, he said, holding up the phone with the flash drive still connected. Naomi moved quickly but without panic, guiding him through the study, her movements precise, practiced, as if she had already walked this path in her mind many times before. They communicate through scheduled drops, she explained, pulling up a hidden folder on the system, encrypted messages that only stay active for a few minutes at a time. Ethan watched as lines of data appeared, timestamps, coded entries, patterns that at first looked random but quickly revealed structure. And the next one, he asked, and Naomi pointed to the screen. 40 minutes, she said. They always confirmed the next step before midnight. Ethan's gaze sharpened. 40 minutes was not long, but it was enough to observe, enough to adjust, enough to begin turning their plan against them. He moved to the desk, his reflection faint in the glass surface, and for a moment he studied it, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that the version of himself they had created was about to become a tool rather than a threat, we let them proceed, he said, more to himself than to Naomi. But we change what they think they are controlling. Naomi crossed her arms slightly, her eyes never leaving him. That means stepping into their system, she said, not as a warning but as a fact, and Ethan nodded. It means becoming exactly what they built, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, only clarity, because if they had spent years studying him, learning him, replicating him, then they had also created something predictable, something he could now anticipate. The sound of a distant car passing outside broke the silence for a brief moment, a reminder that the world beyond these walls was still moving forward. Unaware of the shift happening inside, Ethan turned back to Naomi, his tone quieter now, but more focused than before. You said they started adjusting my life before I noticed, he said. What is the first change you remember that did not make sense? Naomi did not need to think long. Your cancelled meeting in Chicago, 2 years ago, she said immediately. You never cancel meetings like that, but it was marked as your decision. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, the memory surfacing with new context. What had once been a minor inconvenience now felt like the beginning of something deliberate, something designed to test the boundaries of control. Then that is where we start, he said, not because it was the biggest piece, but because it was the first, and the first move in any plan revealed more than the rest. Naomi studied him for a moment longer, and then she gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, but recognition, because whatever this had been before, whatever role she had played in it, it was no longer about observation, it was about action. And as the clock on the wall ticked closer to the next message drop, the silence in the room shifted again, no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but precise, focused, like something had finally aligned, and for the first time since the plan began, it was no longer unfolding without resistance, it was being watched by the one person it was never meant to include. The ticking of the clock on the wall no longer sounded like background noise, it sounded like a countdown, each second precise, deliberate, measurable, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the desk with his eyes fixed on the screen, the encrypted interface waiting, silent, as if it knew exactly when to come alive. 40 minutes had already begun to shrink into something sharper, something urgent, but Ethan did not rush. He adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, controlled motion, the same kind of motion he had seen the other men replicate downstairs, and for a brief moment, the line between original and imitation blurred in his mind, not as confusion, but as strategy, because if someone else could become him, then he could also become the version they expected. When the message comes through, do they expect a response? He asked without looking away from the screen. Naomi stood just behind him, her posture steady, her voice low, not always, but when they do, it has to match the pattern, tone, demean, even the pauses. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, not as a complication but as a framework, something defined, something he could step into. Then we give them exactly what they expect, he said, his voice calm, almost quiet, but underneath it there was something else forming, something sharper. Naomi studied him for a moment, then moved closer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision, pulling up previous exchanges, lines of coded language that at first looked mechanical but slowly revealed rhythm, intention, personality. They build a voice for you, she said, not just how you sound, but how you decide. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his eyes scanning each line, recognizing patterns, the subtle confidence, the calculated restraint, the way decisions were framed as inevitabilities rather than risks. And then he saw it, the difference, small but present, something no one else would notice, but something he could feel, because it was not him. It was a version of him without hesitation, without doubt, without instinct, a perfect imitation that lacked the one thing it could not replicate, lived experience. They made me predictable, he said softly, and Naomi's gaze shifted toward him. That is how they control outcomes, she replied, and Ethan allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Not amused, not pleased, but aware, because predictability worked both ways. If they expected a pattern, then breaking it at the right moment would not create chaos, it would create exposure. The screen flickered suddenly, a soft pulse of light cutting through the stillness, and Naomi's hand froze for half a second before she leaned in. It is starting, she said, her voice steady but quieter now, as if the system itself could hear them. Lines of encrypted text began to form, characters appearing in sequence, precise, controlled, the message assembling itself in real time. Ethan did not blink, did not move. He watched it the way he would watch a negotiation unfold, every word carrying weight, every pause intentional, and then it appeared, complete, a single instruction framed as confirmation, asking for readiness, asking for alignment, asking for the final step to proceed exactly as planned. Naomi glanced at him, just once, a silent question, not of what to do, but of whether he was ready to do it. A tense reflection in the dark screen looked back at him, steady, composed, the same reflection the other man had tried to become, and for a moment, the silence stretched, not uncertain, but deliberate, because this was the point where everything shifted from observation to participation, from watching the plan to stepping inside it. Ethan exhaled slowly, then placed his fingers on the keyboard, matching the posture, the timing, the rhythm he had just studied, not imitating, but aligning, becoming exactly what they believed him to be, and then he tapped, each word measured, each pause intentional, constructing a response that fit perfectly within their expectations. A confirmation that did not challenge, did not question, did not reveal anything beyond what they were already prepared to accept. Naomi watched the screen as the message sent, disappearing into the system as if it had never existed, and for a moment, nothing happened, no immediate reply, no visible reaction, just silence, but it was not empty, it was active, processing, somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the house, beyond everything Ethan could see. The system was adjusting, recalibrating, accepting the input as truth, and that was when Naomi spoke again, quieter than before. Now they believe you are still under control, she said, and Ethan's gaze did not leave the screen, because he already understood what came next. Belief was the foundation of their plan, and he had just stepped inside it without them realizing. Good, he said softly, not as relief, but as confirmation, because for the first time since the plan began, the version of him they trusted was no longer theirs, it was his. The screen went dark again as if nothing had ever passed through it, but Ethan Caldwell did not move, because he understood something most people never did. Silence after action was never empty, it was where reactions formed, where unseen systems shifted, where decisions were made without announcement, and somewhere beyond the walls of the townhouse, beyond the city lights and the late-night traffic, someone had just read his response and believed it, completely, without hesitation. Naomi remained still beside him, her eyes on the interface as if expecting it to flicker again, but instead the room settled into a quiet that felt sharper than before, more focused, less uncertain. They will not respond right away, she said softly, they never do. It creates the illusion of control. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing it, not as information but as confirmation, because that illusion was exactly what he needed them to maintain. Control, or the belief of it, was the only thing holding their plan together, and now that belief had shifted, even if they did not know it yet. Ethan stepped back from the desk slowly, his mind already moving ahead, mapping not just what had happened, but what would happen next. They think I am following the script, he said quietly, his tone measured, so the next step will assume I am still predictable. Naomi turned her head toward him, watching closely. And you are not, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Ethan's gaze moved toward the window, where the faint reflection of the city shimmered against the glass, distant lights blinking like signals in a system far larger than this house. No, he replied. But I need them to believe that I am. He turned back toward the desk, his expression now sharper, more defined, the hesitation that had once been there completely gone, replaced by something controlled and intentional. What is the next scheduled interaction after this? He asked. Naomi moved quickly, pulling up another sequence of data, her fingers moving with precision, scanning timestamps, cross-referencing patterns. Tomorrow morning, she said, a call with the board. They expect you to appear slightly disoriented, uncertain, enough to justify transferring authority. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of stress, but alignment, because that moment, that exact moment, was where everything converged, public perception, legal control, internal trust. Then that is where we shift everything, he said, his voice low but firm. Naomi hesitated for just a fraction of a second. If you break the pattern too early, they will know, she warned, and Ethan nodded, already anticipating that. I am not going to break it, he said, I am going to perfect it. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition, because she understood what that meant. He was not planning to disrupt the illusion, he was planning to deepen it, to become the version of himself they had created so completely that they would not question it until it was too late. They studied you for years, she said, they built that version carefully. Ethan stepped closer to the desk again, his hand resting lightly on the edge, his reflection faint but steady. And now I have studied them, he replied, the balance shifting in that single statement, no longer one-sided, no longer controlled by a hidden system, but contested, observed, Challenged, the quiet hum of the house surrounded them, the soft ticking of the clock, the distant sound of a car passing outside, ordinary sounds that felt almost unreal against the weight of what was unfolding. Naomi glanced back at the screen one more time, as if expecting something else to appear, something unexpected, but nothing came, only the faint glow of the interface waiting for the next input, the next moment, the next move. There is one more thing, she said suddenly, her voice lower now, more careful, and Ethan turned slightly toward her, not surprised, because there was always more. The double, she continued, he is not just trained, he is monitored, they track his performance in real time. Any deviation, any inconsistency, it gets flagged. Ethan considered that for a brief moment, not as a problem, but as a variable, something to incorporate rather than avoid. Then we do not create deviation, he said, we create perfection. Naomi held his gaze, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that suggested uncertainty, but there was none, only clarity, only intention, and that was when she understood something she had not fully realized before. The plan had been built to replace Ethan Caldwell, but it had also defined him, reduced him to patterns, behaviors, predictable outcomes, and now he was stepping beyond that definition, using it against them, reshaping it in real time. The system they trusted was no longer static. It was being rewritten from inside, and as the clock continued to tick, moving closer to midnight, closer to the moment when everything would accelerate, Ethan's voice broke the silence one more time, calm, controlled, and certain. Tomato, they expect a weakened version of me, said, his eyes fixed forward, so that is exactly what they will see. And in the stillness that followed, it became clear that what he meant was not submission, not compliance, but something far more precise, far more dangerous. He was going to give them exactly what they expected, and then change what it meant. The house had not changed, but the way Ethan Caldwell moved through it had, each step quieter, more deliberate, not hiding but calculating, because now every hallway, every reflection in the glass, every faint echo of sound had become part of a larger equation, and somewhere within that equation, someone else believed they were already winning. Naomi followed a few steps behind, not guiding him this time, not pulling him toward safety, but watching, maturing, because what he was about to do was no longer reaction, it was design. If they are tracking the double, Ethan said softly, his voice barely above the hum of the air system, then they are also tracking the environment around him. Naomi nodded once, understanding immediately. Temperature, movement, light changes, digital signals, anything that confirms consistency. Ethan paused near the base of the staircase, his eyes lifting toward the upper floor where just minutes ago another version of him had stood, spoken, existed. Without question, then we give them consistency, he said, and the way he said it carried something deeper than imitation, something intentional. Naomi stepped closer, her voice lower now, more cautious. That means you cannot stay hidden for long, she said. At some point, the system expects activity, presence. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not away from the stairs but beyond them, as if he could already see the next version of the scene unfolding. Then I stop hiding, he replied. And for a moment, Naomi did not move, because that was not part of the safe path, not part of any plan that reduced risk. If they see you too soon, she began, but Ethan cut her off quietly, not sharply, just firmly. They will not see me, he said, and then he turned, not toward the hidden passage, but toward the main hallway, toward the open space where light touched the floor in clean, uninterrupted lines. They will see what they expect, he added, and now Naomi understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize the direction. He was not stepping out as himself, not yet. Was stepping into the version they had created, but on his own terms. Upstairs, the faint creak of wood settled into silence, the house holding its breath in that strange, suspended way, and Ethan began to move, his posture shifting subtly, shoulders relaxing just enough, his pace adjusting, slower, slightly uneven, not exaggerated, not forced, but precise, controlled imperfection, the kind that would not draw attention, but would confirm expectation. Naomi watched him from behind, her expression tightening slightly, because the transformation was not dramatic, it was exact, the same version she had seen in the footage, the same version they had built, now being performed by the original, and that realization carried something heavier than any risk. It meant the line between control and resistance had disappeared entirely. Ethan reached the bottom step and paused, just long enough to create a moment, just long enough for any unseen system to register presence, and then he spoke, not loudly, not clearly, but with a slight hesitation woven into the tone. Victoria, The name left his mouth with the exact weight it needed, familiar, but uncertain, and the sound echoed lightly through the space. Disappearing into the quiet, no answer came, but that was not the point. The point was the signal, the confirmation, the pattern continuing exactly as expected. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly toward the corners of the ceiling, toward the places where unseen devices might be. Watching, recording, confirming, and then back to Ethan, who had already begun to turn away, as if the call had been an afterthought, as if nothing in the moment required urgency, everything about it aligned, every detail fitting perfectly into the structure they trusted, and that was when the smallest shift occurred, not in the room, not in the house, but somewhere beyond it, a system updating, a pattern confirmed, a variable settling into place. Ethan walked slowly toward the study again, his movements consistent, his expression neutral, but behind it, his mind remained sharp, tracking every second, every possibility, every reaction that might follow, and Naomi followed, not because she needed to guide him, but because she understood now that this was no longer about hiding from the plan, it was about stepping so completely inside it that it could no longer distinguish control from resistance. And as the door to the study closed softly behind them, Ethan's voice dropped again, returning to its true form, calm, precise, unmistakably his. "Now they are watching," he said, and Naomi nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper. They always were, and for a moment, the silence between them felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but aligned, because for the first time since this began, the system they feared was no longer something outside of them, it was something they had entered, something they were now moving through from within. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the reach of sight, the people who believed they had control were still watching the same pattern, still seeing the same version of Ethan Caldwell, completely unaware that the one they trusted was no longer the one they controlled. The quiet inside the study no longer felt like protection, it felt like a stage, every shadow carefully placed, every surface reflecting just enough to confirm presence, and Ethan Caldwell stood near the desk without sitting, without settling, because stillness now had to be intentional, controlled, observed. Naomi remained by the door, her posture angled slightly as if she could hear beyond the walls, as if the silence itself carried signals she had learned to read. "If they are watching in real time," Ethan said quietly, his voice returned to its true tone but lowered, contained, "then they are not just tracking behavior, they are waiting for confirmation." Naomi nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Confirmation of consistency," she replied, "that nothing has changed." Ethan glanced toward the dark screen where the earlier message had disappeared, the blankness now more telling than any response, because it meant acceptance. It meant the system had absorbed his presence without resistance. "Then we give them more than consistency," he said, and Naomi looked at him carefully, because the shift in his voice was subtle but real. "We give them progression," he added, and now the idea took shape, not just maintaining the illusion, but advancing it, deepening it in a way that would lock their expectations even tighter. Naomi stepped closer, her voice quieter now, more precise. "Progression means behavior change within pattern," she said, "small adjustments that feel natural." Ethan nodded once, his mind already moving through possibilities, not random actions, not improvisation, but controlled evolution, something that would feel authentic to the version they had built, but still belonged to him. "What did they expect me to do after tonight?" he asked. Naomi moved quickly to the system again, pulling up another sequence. "You usually review documents late, respond to 2 or 3 non-critical messages, and delay one decision until morning," she said. "It creates the impression of fatigue, of slowing down." Ethan listened, then let the pattern settle in his mind, not as instruction, but as a script he could now perform with precision. "Then we follow it," he said. "Exactly." Naomi hesitated for a brief moment. "Exactly," she repeated, and Ethan looked at her, calm, focused. "Until the moment it matters," he said, and that was the difference, not disruption, not resistance, but timing. Naomi exhaled slowly, understanding now that he was not reacting to their plan, he was entering it fully, allowing it to unfold just enough to reveal its structure. The study lights cast a soft glow across the desk as Ethan reached for a stack of documents left neatly aligned, his fingers brushing the edge, the paper cool, untouched, but already part of the system's expectations. He sat down slowly, his posture shifting again, not dramatically, but enough, shoulders slightly lower, movements measured, just enough to match the version they believed him to be. He opened the first file, scanning it without rushing, his eyes moving steadily, absorbing details, not because the content mattered, but because the act itself was being observed, being recorded, being confirmed somewhere beyond his reach. Naomi watched him closely, her expression tightening just slightly, because the precision was exact, too exact, the same rhythm, the same pauses, the same subtle signs of fatigue. It was no longer imitation, it was embodiment, and that realization carried a weight she could not ignore. Ethan reached for his phone next, selecting a message from the list Naomi had shown him earlier. Something routine, something insignificant. He read it, paused, then typed a response, short, controlled, just enough to maintain the pattern, and sent it without hesitation, the action small, almost invisible, but within the system, it would register as confirmation, another piece of consistency, another signal that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Naomi shifted slightly near the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are giving them everything they expect," she said. And Ethan did not look up, his eyes still on the page in front of him. "Not everything," he replied quietly, and there was something in that answer that changed the weight of the room again, something beneath the surface, something not yet visible. Minutes passed, each one deliberate, each action placed carefully within the pattern, until the room itself seemed to settle into the rhythm they had built for him, the illusion complete, the system satisfied, and then, without warning, the screen flickered again, not with a message, but with a notification, subtle, almost hidden, but Naomi saw it immediately, her body tensing just enough to give it away. "It is not scheduled," she whispered. "And it then has lifted slowly, his expression unchanged. But his focus sharpened instantly, because unscheduled meant adjustment, it meant something had shifted beyond their control, beyond their expectations, and as the notification expanded into a new line of encrypted text, forming faster than before, more direct, more precise, Ethan understood something immediately. The system was no longer just observing, it was responding, and whatever came next would not follow the pattern they had prepared for. The new line of encrypted text did not behave like the others, it did not assemble slowly or follow the familiar rhythm, it appeared almost instantly, complete, direct, and that alone told Ethan Caldwell everything he needed to know. This was not part of the routine, this was not observation, this was intervention. Naomi stepped closer without realizing it, her eyes locked on the screen, her voice barely forming the words. "They are checking," she whispered. And Ethan did not respond immediately, because he was already reading, already analyzing the structure of the message, the phrasing, the absence of buffer language, the way it skipped the usual coded layers and went straight to confirmation. Not of action, but of identity, and that shift was subtle, but critical. It meant something in the system had triggered a need for verification. Not suspicion yet, but attention. "They want a live response," Naomi said, her tone tightening slightly, "something immediate, something that cannot be pre-written." Ethan's gaze did not leave the screen, because the difference between prepared and real-time was where most plans failed, where patterns broke, where control slipped, and yet, instead of reacting, he leaned back slightly in the chair, his posture adjusting again, slower now, more deliberate, as if the weight of the moment had settled onto him. "Then we give them real time," he said quietly, and Naomi turned toward him, searching his face for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that suggested risk, but there was none, only clarity, only intent. "They are testing for deviation," she said, tone, demean, unpredictability. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it, because that was exactly where the system believed it had the advantage, where a constructed identity would fail under pressure, where the original would reveal something that could not be replicated. "Good," he replied softly, and the word did not carry relief, it carried opportunity, because unpredictability was not something they could measure perfectly, it was something they had tried to remove from him, to smooth out, to control, and now, it was the one thing he could use. His fingers moved toward the keyboard again, but this time he did not rush. It did not match the previous pattern exactly. He paused longer, just enough to suggest hesitation, just enough to align with the version of him they expected at this stage, slightly slower, slightly less certain. Naomi watched closely, her breath held without realizing it, because this moment was different. This was not repetition, this was improvisation within structure, a narrow space where one wrong move could shift everything. The cursor blinked on the screen, steady, waiting, and Ethan began to type, each word forming carefully, not too precise, not too clean, leaving small imperfections, small pauses, the kind that felt natural, the kind that suggested thought rather than calculation. And when he finished, he did not send it immediately. He waited, counting silently, matching the internal rhythm he had observed earlier, and then he pressed send, the message disappearing into the system just as the others had, but carrying something different, Something unmeasured, something real. The seconds that followed stretched longer than before, not because time had changed, but because the outcome mattered more. Naomi's eyes flicked between the screen and Ethan, as if she could see the response forming somewhere beyond reach, and then the screen flickered again, not instantly, but quickly, faster than the previous delay, the system reacting, processing, and a new line appeared, shorter this time, more direct, almost neutral. A confirmation without challenge, without escalation, and that was when Naomi exhaled, the tension in her shoulders releasing just slightly. They accepted it, she said, her voice still low but steadier now. Ethan did not move, his gaze still fixed on the screen. Because acceptance did not mean safety, it meant continuation, it meant the test had passed, but the system had learned something in the process. No, he said quietly, and Naomi turned toward him again, her brow tightening slightly. They adapted, he corrected, and that distinction settled heavily into the room, because it meant the balance had shifted again, not fully, not completely, but enough to matter. The system was no longer just following its plan. It was responding, adjusting, evolving, and that meant the next step would not be predictable, not entirely. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the desk, his mind already moving ahead, because if they had tested him once, they would test again, and each test would become more precise, more targeted, until something broke, until something revealed itself. They are not looking for proof anymore, he said, his voice calm but focused. They are looking for a mistake. Naomi nodded slowly, understanding the shift, the pressure now building beneath the surface, invisible but constant, and as the screen returned to stillness once more, the quiet in the room changed again. Not heavier, not louder, but sharper, because somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the system, beyond everything they could see, the people behind it were no longer just observing, they were paying attention, and that meant the next move would not be part of the plan they had studied. It would be something new, something designed to force the truth into the open, whether Ethan was ready or not. The silence that followed the last response did not settle the room, it sharpened it, turning every second into something measurable, something that could no longer be ignored. And Ethan Caldwell remained seated at the desk with his eyes fixed on the blank screen, not because he expected another message, but because he understood what came next would not arrive as text, it would arrive as action. Naomi stood still behind him, her posture tense in a way that suggested she already felt the shift before it became visible. If they are looking for a mistake, she said quietly, they will not ask for it again. Ethan nodded slightly, because repetition created patterns, and patterns were no longer their strategy. Unpredictability was, and that meant the next move would not be digital, it would be physical, something observable, something that forced presence into the open. They will change the environment, he said, his voice calm, controlled, but lower now, as if the walls themselves required caution. Naomi's eyes moved instinctively toward the hallway, toward the spaces beyond the study, and then back to him. Someone will come here, she said, not as a guess, but as a certainty. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his mind already adjusting, because presence could not be avoided, it had to be managed, shaped, controlled the same way everything else had been. Then we let them, he replied, and Naomi's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the risk, because physical presence introduced variables that could not be fully controlled. Tone could be adjusted, messages could be crafted, but a face, a gesture, a moment of eye contact, those things carried weight, carried truth, carried the potential to break everything. The faint sound of a car door closing outside reached them through the quiet, subtle, distant, but unmistakable, and Naomi's head turned toward the window instantly, her voice dropping to a whisper. That is not scheduled. Ethan did not move immediately, because reacting too quickly would break the rhythm he had already established. Instead he let a few seconds pass, just enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy, and then he stood, slowly, deliberately, his posture shifting again into that controlled imperfection, the version they expected, the version they trusted. Stay here, he said quietly, not as an order, but as a necessity. Naomi hesitated, her eyes searching his for a moment, and then she nodded once, stepping back toward the shadow near the wall, where she could observe without being seen, where she had always existed within this system. Ethan walked toward the door of the study, each step measured, his pace slightly uneven, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm expectation, and as his hand reached for the handle, he paused, just for a fraction of a second, grounding himself in the role he was about to play. The door opened with a soft sound, the hallway beyond stretching quiet and still, but no longer empty. Footsteps echoed faintly from the front of the house, steady, confident, familiar, and then a voice followed, clear, composed, unmistakable. Ethan? Victoria Hale stepped into view, her presence calm, controlled, her expression unreadable at first glance, but her eyes sharp, searching, assessing, and in that single moment, the distance between plan and reality collapsed, because this was no longer a system, no longer a pattern, it was a confrontation without accusation, a test without warning. Ethan lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers with just enough delay, just enough uncertainty, the version she expected to see. Victoria, he said, his voice carrying that subtle hesitation, that carefully placed imperfection, and she smiled, not fully, not warmly, but enough to acknowledge the moment, enough to continue the performance. You are home early, she said, her tone light, but her eyes never leaving his face, never missing a detail, and Ethan allowed a brief pause before responding, as if searching for the answer within himself. I thought I was, he said quietly, and the words landed exactly where they needed to, uncertain, slightly disoriented, perfectly aligned with the version they had built, but beneath that surface, beneath the controlled delivery, something else moved, something unseen, something that neither the system nor Victoria could fully measure, because while she stood there observing him, evaluating him, searching for the smallest inconsistency, she did not yet realize that the man in front of her was no longer the one they had prepared for. And as the silence between them stretched just a little longer than expected, just enough to shift the balance, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. This was not the moment the plan ended, this was the moment it truly began. Victoria did not move closer right away, and that hesitation, subtle and nearly invisible, revealed more than any direct question could, because she was not just observing Ethan Caldwell, she was measuring him, comparing what she saw to something she already knew, something she expected to match perfectly. And Ethan stood there in the hallway, his posture slightly uneven, his expression calm but faintly unfocused, holding the version of himself they had built with careful precision. You were not answering your messages, she said, her tone light but controlled, as if the statement carried no weight, and yet her eyes never left his, never blinked long enough to miss a shift, a delay, a contradiction. Ethan let a small pause settle between them before responding, his gaze drifting slightly as if searching for clarity. I might have missed a few, he said quietly, and the way he said it aligned exactly with the expectation, not defensive, not certain, just enough uncertainty to confirm the pattern. Victoria tilted her head slightly, the movement graceful, calculated. That is not like you, she replied, and now there was something beneath the surface, not accusation, not yet, but pressure, gentle, deliberate. Testing the boundaries of his response, Ethan allowed a faint exhale, as if the effort of standing there had taken something from him. Lately, a few things have not felt like me, he said, and the words landed carefully, not as resistance, but as reflection. Something that could be interpreted as confusion rather than awareness, and for a fraction of a second, Victoria's expression shifted, not enough to reveal concern, but enough to confirm that the line had been noticed, that the system behind her was listening as much as she was. You should rest, she said smoothly, stepping closer now, her voice softening just slightly. Tomorrow is important. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes lowering for a brief moment before returning to her face. You have been reminding me of that, he replied, and again, the phrasing held weight, subtle, layered, something that could pass as fatigue, but also carried something else, something that existed just beneath the surface. Victoria's gaze sharpened for a moment, as if the words had brushed against something she could not fully define, and then she smiled again, controlled, composed. Because it matters, she said, and her tone was steady, confident, but Ethan noticed something now, something small but real. The rhythm of her speech had shifted slightly, just enough to suggest she was no longer fully certain, just enough to indicate that the test was not proceeding exactly as planned. The silence between them stretched for a second longer than expected, and in that space, Ethan understood something clearly. She was waiting, not for a response, but for a mistake, something unmeasured, something outside the pattern, and so he gave her nothing, only the version she expected, only the controlled imperfection they had built together. I should look over the documents again, he said quietly, his voice carrying that same measured uncertainty, just to be sure. Victoria's eyes flicked for a moment toward the study, then back to him, calculating, adjusting, and then she nodded. Of course, she said, stepping slightly to the side, allowing him space to move, but not removing herself from the moment, not stepping out of observation. Ethan turned slowly, his movement deliberate, his pace consistent with the role he was maintaining, and as he passed her, their shoulders nearly aligned, close enough for presence to register, for proximity to become part of the test, and still, he gave nothing away, no shift, no hesitation beyond what was expected. As he walked back toward the study, the silence behind him followed, heavy but controlled, and Naomi remained where she had been, unseen, her breath held as she watched the exchange unfold, understanding now that this was no longer just about deception. It was about endurance, about maintaining a version of reality long enough to let the truth emerge on its own terms. Ethan reached the desk again, his hand resting lightly against the surface as he lowered himself into the chair. His reflection faint in the dark screen, and for a moment, everything aligned again, the pattern restored, the system satisfied, but beneath that alignment, something else continued to build, something that could not be measured by tone or timing. Something that neither Victoria nor the system behind her could fully detect, and as she remained in the doorway, watching, waiting, Ethan understood that the next move would not come from her alone. It would come from whatever was watching through her, whatever had been planning this for years, and whatever was now beginning to realize that something, somewhere, was no longer following the script. Victoria did not leave the doorway, and that alone shifted the balance of the room, because her presence was no longer passive observation, it was control, quiet, deliberate, patient control. And Ethan Caldwell felt it without needing to look up, felt the way the air held differently when someone was not just watching, but waiting for something specific to happen. His fingers moved slowly across the documents on the desk, turning a page with measured care, not rushing, not hesitating, maintaining the rhythm he had already established. While behind him, Naomi remained still in the shadow, her eyes fixed on Victoria, understanding now that this was no longer a simple test, this was escalation. "You always read faster than that," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to feel natural, but not enough to be innocent. Ethan allowed a pause, just long enough to suggest effort, before responding without looking up. "I have been taking my time lately," he said, his tone steady but faintly distant, and the words landed exactly where they needed to, a continuation of the pattern, a reinforcement of the version they expected. Victoria stepped one pace further into the room, the soft sound of her heels against the floor marking the shift from distance to proximity, and Ethan could feel it, the change in pressure, the narrowing of space. "That is not efficient," she said, her voice still calm, still composed, but now carrying something else beneath it, something sharper, something that did not belong to the surface conversation. Ethan turned another page slowly, letting the silence stretch before answering. "Neither is repeating the same mistake," he said quietly, and the moment the words left his mouth, something in the room changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to register, enough to matter. Victoria's expression did not break, but her stillness did, just slightly, just enough to reveal that the line had crossed into something unplanned. Her eyes narrowed by a fraction, her focus sharpening. "What mistake?" she asked, and now the question was no longer casual, no longer part of the performance, it was precise, targeted, designed to draw something out. Ethan lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers with just enough delay. Used enough uncertainty still layered into his expression, but beneath it, something else existed now, something steadier, something that did not belong to the version they had built. "Assuming I do not notice." "Patterns," he said, and the words hung between them, not loud, not aggressive, but clear, unmistakable in their meaning. Naomi's breath caught silently in the corner, her body tightening as she realized what was happening. This was no longer endurance, this was exposure, not full, not complete, but enough to shift the ground beneath everything. Victoria held his gaze, and for the first time since she had entered the house, the calm certainty in her eyes faltered. Not gone, but altered, as if something she relied on had moved just slightly out of place. "You are tired," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, but the softness did not match the tension beneath it. Ethan let a faint, almost imperceptible smile touch the corner of his expression, not warm, not reassuring, just present. "That is what they expect," he replied, and the word "they" did not belong to the script, it did not belong to the pattern, and the moment it appeared, the room shifted again, deeper this time, more defined. Victoria's posture straightened, her composure tightening, not breaking, but adjusting, recalculating, and in that moment, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. She was no longer just observing for confirmation. She was reassessing the entire situation. Naomi took a small step forward without realizing it, drawn by the shift, by the gravity of what was unfolding, and Ethan remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the desk. His gaze steady now, no longer drifting, no longer uncertain, because the line had been crossed, not fully, not beyond recovery, but enough to reveal that the system they trusted was no longer complete. Who have you been speaking to? Victoria asked, her voice controlled again, but tighter now, more focused, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, as if deciding how much of the truth belonged in this moment. The same people you have, he said quietly, and the answer did not accuse, did not confirm, it existed in that narrow space between, where meaning could not be easily contained. The silence that followed stretched longer than any before, not empty, not passive, but charged, because something had shifted in both directions. The illusion had not broken, but it had cracked, and through that crack, something real had begun to show, something neither side had fully prepared for, and as Victoria stood there, no longer just the observer but now part of the uncertainty, Ethan understood that the next move would not be subtle, it would not be hidden within patterns or messages, it would come directly, clearly, and whatever it was, it would decide who truly controlled what came next. The silence after Ethan Caldwell's last words did not feel like a pause anymore, it felt like a boundary, something invisible but undeniable that both he and Victoria now stood on opposite sides of. And for the first time since she stepped into the house, she did not respond immediately, her eyes fixed on him with a precision that no longer tried to hide itself, because the performance had shifted, the pattern had cracked, and whatever came next would not rely on subtlety. You are not supposed to know that, she said finally, her voice calm, but stripped of the softness she had been using before, and the words did not sound like a question, they sounded like a recalculation. Ethan remained seated, his posture steady now, no longer carrying the controlled uncertainty they had built into him, because there was no reason to maintain it, not anymore. And yet I do, he replied quietly, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Naomi stepped forward just enough to be seen now, no longer hidden, no longer part of the background, and that single movement changed the room again, because her presence was not expected, not part of any script. Victoria's gaze flicked toward her instantly, sharp, assessing, and in that moment, another layer of the plan revealed itself, not in words, but in reaction. You, Victoria said, her tone tightening just slightly, and Naomi held her ground, her voice calm but firm. It was never going to work the way you planned, she said, and the words did not challenge, they confirmed, they acknowledged something already broken. Victoria's expression hardened for a fraction of a second, not losing control, but shifting into something more direct, more precise. You were supposed to report deviations, she said, and Naomi's eyes did not waver. I did, she replied, just not to you. The silence that followed carried something heavier now, not uncertainty, but exposure, because in that single exchange, roles had shifted completely, observer had become participant, control had become contested. Ethan stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, and when he did, the room seemed to adjust around him, the balance aligning with his movement rather than hers. You built a system that depends on predictability, he said, his voice calm, but no longer restrained, and then you assumed I would stay inside it. Victoria's gaze returned to him, steady, but no longer certain, because the foundation she relied on had changed. You were predictable, she replied, and there was truth in the statement, not denial, not defensiveness, just fact. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging it. That was the version you studied, he said, and the distinction settled clearly between them, past and present no longer aligned. Victoria took a slow breath, her composure returning in layers, not fully restored, but enough to continue, because whatever this was, it was not over, not yet. Tomorrow still happens, she said, her tone regaining control. The board, the transfer, everything proceeds. Ethan allowed a faint pause, not to consider, but to let the weight of her certainty settle before responding. Yes, he said, and the agreement landed unexpectedly, causing the smallest shift in her expression, just enough to reveal surprise. It does, he continued, and now there was something beneath the words, something she could not immediately define. Something that did not fit into the structure she had built. Naomi glanced toward him briefly, understanding the direction before it was fully spoken, because this was not resistance, this was redefinition. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for the angle, the flaw, the hidden meaning. Then nothing has changed, she said, testing the statement as much as asserting it. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his voice steady, controlled, but unmistakably his. Everything has, he replied, and the words did not raise in volume, did not push forward, they settled into the room with quiet certainty, because what he meant was not that the plan had stopped. It was that the ownership of it had shifted, the structure remained, the sequence remained, but the control no longer belonged where it had before. The silence that followed did not stretch this time, it held, contained, because both of them understood the same thing now, Tomato would still happen, the board would still meet, the decision would still be made, but the outcome was no longer guaranteed, not by the system, not by the plan, not by anything that had been prepared, and as Victoria stood there, no longer just the architect of the moment but now part of its uncertainty, Ethan understood that the final move would not be decided tonight, it would be decided in front of everyone, in the place where the illusion was meant to become reality, and for the first time since this began, that reality no longer belonged to them alone.